Want to quickly welcome everyone to the University of Toronto, the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design, for kind of a conclusion of course, the series of talks we've had all semester on the topics of sovereignty and colonization. But today is a very special kind of end of the conversation. I'm the Director of Visual Studies here, and I want to kind of pass it over to my colleague Stephanie Smith to kind of introduce more the reason for the season.
Okay, great. Well, I won't take the season, but I'll take tonight. So how about that? Hi, I'm Stephanie Smith. I'm the Chief Curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege to be here across, just up the street a little bit with a wonderful group of colleagues and friends. We're here, I'm standing here in front of the podium because Charles and I are collaborators in facilitating a new partnership between Afterall Journal, the University of Toronto, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. And we're very excited about launching this partnership in public tonight. We have been in conversation with a group of people over the course of today. Charles is going to say a little bit more about that in a moment, but really digging into some of the questions that will also be taken up by the panel around issues of indigeneity, decolonization, the role of the institution, the work of individuals, and it's been a rich and tough and generative conversation, and we are excited about the opportunity to be working together to facilitate this kind of conversation in the city, to have opportunities to engage in rich exchange that has an opportunity to contribute in meaningful ways to the life of this city and to wider conversations about art's many roles in the world. So tonight is a kind of public launch of the partnership. It will lead into material that will be published online and in the journal in some way, and also into other public moments in the future where we will continue these conversations and get to continue to spend time together as we dig into these big topics. So back over to Charles.
Thank you, Stephanie. Before I get to our illustrious guests of the evening, again, it's been a long day, I'm sure for everyone, particularly I know for a few people. We've been kind of at it since 9 o'clock this morning, talking about a lot of these issues that hopefully, as Stephanie said, or not hopefully, it will be integrated into the journal, both in sense of structure and also in the sense of content. And hopefully we'll return next year to have a public symposium of a lot of the thinkers and writers that we're meeting today, and hopefully a few guests coming into town. In the meantime, we thought it would be remiss not to at least have one public event while the editorial team was here. And part of that, of course, is these three guests. But I really want to acknowledge the 12 or so guests that we had today for the 7-8 hours kind of going at it and really exchanging different ideas and viewpoints. So I want to acknowledge them because we couldn't have like 16 people on stage or we would be here for 7 hours, which I'm sure some of you like the marathon format, some of you don't. So I just want to, yeah, you love it? Okay. So I want to acknowledge Bonnie Devine, Cheyenne Turin, Dwayne Linklater, Ryan Rice, Lee Merkel, Ronaldo Walcott, Louis Jacob, Georgiana Ulrika, Andrew Hunter, Barbara Fisher, Karen Recollet. So these were 12 people today that really, I think, will inform the conversation that we're going to continue kind of the public part today. I want to thank those people for their incredible contribution to the ideas. So the three people that are sitting at that table are Gerald McMaster from stage right to stage left. Gerald McMaster is a Canada Research Chair of Indigenous Visual Culture and Curatorial Practices at the OCAD University. He's a writer, artist, and curator, a former student of the Institute of American Indian Art, earned a BFA from where he earned a BFA. Also from the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, an MA from Carleton University, and a PhD from the University of Amsterdam. He has worked at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and the Art Gallery of Ontario, responsible for advancing major reinstallations of these exhibitions. And of course, there's a list of many exhibitions, probably some of them very influential to the people in the audience. So I'm going to skip to kind of some high points, including in 1995, he was the Canadian commissioner for the Edward Poitras exhibition at the Venice Biennale. And in 2002, he was the co-artistic director of the 18th Biennial of Sydney, entitled All Our Relations. He holds Canada's highest order, the Officer of the Order of Canada. Sitting beside him is Wanda Nanibush and Afterall, image and word warrior, curator, and community organizer from the Beausoleil First Nation. Currently, Nanibush is a guest curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario and touring her exhibition, The Fifth World. She has a master's degree from the visual studies at the University of Toronto here, so welcome back. And has taught doctoral courses of Indigenous history and politics at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, or as we know, OISE here at the University of Toronto. Nanibush has over 20 years of experience in the arts sector through working with many media arts organizations such as Imagine Native, LIFT, Optic Nerve Film Festival, Reform Festival, and other arts organizations like the Ontario Arts Council, the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective, and I don't know how to say this actually, ADPAVA? Is that? My apologies, being new to Toronto, in the roles of programmer, festival coordinator, and an Aboriginal arts officer, and of course, an executive director. Our last guest for the evening is, I had to edit these bios considerably, but I'm trying to hit the high points. So Charles Esche is a curator and writer living in Edinburgh, Scotland, and Eindhoven, the Netherlands. He's the director of contemporary art and curating at Central St. Martin's College of Art, and editorial director and co-founder with Mark Lewis of the Afterall Journal and its many imprints, such as Exhibition Histories and the One Work series. In 2014, he was curator of the 31st São Paulo Biennial with a team of 7. In addition to his directorial curating, he has co-curated a number of major international exhibitions, including the U3 Triennial in Ljubljana in 2011, the Rivak Biennial and Ramallah with Ramin Farah in 2007 and 2009, Istanbul Biennial with Vasif Kortan in 2005, the Gwangju Biennial with Hu Honru in 2002. In 2012, he was awarded the Princess Margaret Award for Cultural Change by the European Cultural Foundation. Did you get knighted? You got knighted as well. And finally, in 2014, the Audrey Hermes CCS Bard College Prize for Curatorial Excellence. That was the short bio you sent me. So it's Scottish. With that I want to move into the conversation. And we kind of had a few questions to kind of start, and we'll see where that goes. And so the first one that we kind of wanted to ask was, and I'm going to sit down in a moment and not stand the whole time, is if you could each kind of explain, does that work? Hello? From your own perspective, because one of the key points of moving this conversation into the arena of a public journal was the aspect that these questions of sovereignty, colonization, are not just academic conversations. That these aren't just words, though words are extremely powerful, as we'll get to talk about tonight, but that these are very personally invested narratives, personally invested politics. And I'm wondering if you could each kind of, to open the conversation up, just position yourself in relation to the question, what is or what stake do you have in the global indigenous? Who wants to go first?
You have to pick.
Gerald, why don't we start with you?
Well, okay. I'm sitting almost barefoot here today. I took my shoes off. Earlier today, I called my wife. I said, she's in Ottawa right now, and I said, could you go into my cupboard? And that's where I have my dance outfit. I used to dance. I used to be a powwow dancer. But I haven't been a powwow dancer in 35 years. So I said, can you dig out my moccasins? I mean, I don't know why I asked her that. I just said, can you dig out my moccasins? Maybe it had something to do with today, you know? Somehow I needed to feel connected back to the earth. But how can I be connected back to the earth in Toronto? So I thought, well, maybe it's one way of expressing myself with all my friends and colleagues and you all. by wearing my moccasins, and I think I could probably do that in my office when I'm meeting people, etc. But I don't think I can do that walking around. But anyhow, what's my stake in all this?
Global.
In global. Well, I'm interested in this country of Canada. It is made up of 30 to 35 million people, many of whom are immigrants or newcomers to Canada, which then confuses the original peoples that were here. And so this notion that the original peoples exist against someone else perhaps is the reason we're talking about indigeneity, because it presupposes that there was somebody here prior. You look on the map, if we all look on the map, the Canadian map, we realize, where all Canadians live, and we all live like along the border, along the 49th parallel. And, so what, are we all trying to race over to the United States, to move the United States? Or are we trying to prevent all the Americans who want to come move here after Donald Trump becomes president? I don't know. But that's where we all live. We all live along the border, which is kind of interesting. There are indigenous peoples that live across the border, along the border, but you realize that that border was severed a lot of those communities right in half. So a lot of our relatives are just across the border, So we always have to show our passports. Or nowadays, what's interesting is that we can actually show our Indian card, our status card, which is now becoming, will not necessarily replace a passport, but it'll actually be an instrument that you can actually use with a lot of the metrics that are contained within inside, that all our passports have. But that's those of us, like where I'm from in Saskatchewan, all our communities are across the border. So all our Canadians live along the border. But if you look at the Indian map, at an indigenous map, it's really quite remarkably different, because what you'll see on that map are indigenous peoples every other place in the country. We occupy every other part. And to me that was interesting, to know that we live everywhere. And so I'm interested in that. So why is it that indigenous people live where they do? Why do the rest of us live along the southern border? So it's an interesting conundrum about this notion of indigeneity and our relationship with the rest of Canada. The other stake that I have, perhaps, and a long-time interest is, I grew up and came of age, perhaps, this notion of indigeneity in the 1970s. And in 1973, in particular, two events happened. One was in February, in the middle of winter. I was working, I was just out of high school. I was in Saskatoon. And on the television came this flash report that militant Indians had taken over Wounded Knee in South Dakota. We thought, all my friends were like, what's going on? This is exciting, We ought to be down there with everyone else, We ought to be going down there to South Dakota, and we almost went down there. But what was interesting about that was, here was the first time that I think, and probably others would probably corroborate that indigenous peoples in Canada and even in the United States were present in the national media. Up until then, we were totally invisible, never to be heard from again until that moment. I thought that was really exciting, about the visibility that it had to take in order to have a sense of being. And we're, of course, called militant Indians, The second event, and I think that was really that galvanized a lot of people, certainly people of my age, to have that sense of of pride, out of this sense of being visible. Later that year, in 1973, I went to school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. What a culture shock. Young prairie boy going into the middle of New Mexico, and it was a total culture shock when I arrived. But what was fascinating was arriving at a school. It was called the Institute of American Indian Art. And there were students from all across the United States. I think I was the only Canadian at the time. Students, indigenous, tribal, students from all across the United States going to this school, this art school, to learn about art. And to me, that was exciting. It was very exciting to see, to know that there were other students that were interested in the same issues that I was. And it was probably around this time that, this notion of indigeneity, although we didn't call it at that time, really hit me. And I think that those two events, as I say, galvanized my interest until this day. One being Wounded Knee, and the other actually, hi guys, and meeting other indigenous peoples. And I think that that was critical for me. I mean, of course, I grew up on a reservation. I knew my people, but that's not the same. It's not the same as meeting a Navajo or meeting Inuit or Ojibwe. Well, we knew Ojibwes, of course.
Yeah, you really did.
Anishinaabe, you're our neighbors, But it was that sense of, there's a terrible, interesting sense of otherness, but also a kind of a sense of similarity. So that to me was perhaps my personal issue where it began, where I felt that I needed to discover who I was, and discovering who I was had to be against others, other indigenous peoples in America, in the U.S. and Canada. There's many more opportunities that I have had through, over the years, meeting indigenous peoples across the globe, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South America, sitting alongside indigenous peoples in ceremonies, whether it's a Pofri and with the Maori in New Zealand, whether it's a shaking tent or Sundance back home, or on the Northwest Coast in Longhouse. Having to share with indigenous peoples a sense of who they are and what they do. So I've traveled along the way. I've spent most of the 70s, as I said, I've spent most of the 70s in the Powwow Trail, learning what the powwow was. But traveling across Canada, traveling across the United States and South America, I learned a couple things along the way. And what is it that draws indigenous peoples together? Well, humor is a big thing. Tremendous sense of the land, tremendous sense of language, and a sense of place. With the exception of, say, the American Indians who were forcibly removed from their territories east of the Mississippi to an area called Indian Country, which is Oklahoma today. Most other indigenous peoples tend to be located in the territories where their ancestors have always been, so that our maps, the indigenous maps of the land, of the territory, define who we are. Our stories are based on the mountains, on the lakes, on the rivers. Any particular formation or deformation in the land is inscribed in us. Our stories are inscribed in those places. It defines who we are. So this idea of going elsewhere, this idea of having a choice of leaving home is tantamount, I think, to our indigeneity. And I think that, there's not many indigenous peoples that are diasporic in the sense of going the rest of the world. They may be diasporic and leaving the rest to the urban area, but that's the only place, I think indigenous peoples tend to stay where they were raised, they're born, their ancestors are. That's where their language is, that's where they're connected to. So it's an interesting kind of the pairing or the kind of languages that we all speak, about what indigeneity is or what others are about. So this is what I think is the stake in my interest in the subject. So.
Right, thank you, Gerald. Wanda, you almost had time to write a whole epistle there, so why don't you go into it?
It has been an intense day of communicating and sharing. I just want to acknowledge Canada coast to coast as Indigenous territory, and acknowledge Toronto as Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, shared for different periods of time with the Haudenosaunee under the One Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And thank my ancestors for me being here today. Okay. Global Indigenous. And I like that it has a question mark. I'm going to put a lot of things under the term global, which we use other words for, but for the purposes of this conversation, I am not going to be a stickler with language. So global Indigenous as a conglomerate together makes me think of a number of things. The first thing is that we were always global prior to contact. So I think about work that somebody like Michael Belmore has done to sort of trace the lineages of copper as it travels from here down to Mexico, or the ways in which all the roots that we had, both R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S, transcended the current boundaries that we live under. And I think that mentality and that mobility and that movement and trade is still present today. I think that global also, for me, is another name for colonization. So globalization, it maps itself onto very much the same roots of colonial extraction. Out of Africa, out of North America, out of South America. So I think about the negative side of globalization, and that largely corporations and nation states, they're born within this kind of concept. And so the global also becomes a way in which we can fight these kinds of things. I think as Indigenous people, we've been organizing globally for a very long time with each other, maybe under the auspices of the UN and things like that, or maybe in the arts. But I think there's still room to grow in terms of our ability to hit a corporation from multiple global points at once, because usually that corporation is in many, many territories, and most of them are Indigenous. So I think of the global as a space where we can coordinate those efforts and hit them from many fronts. I think of the global also as a way, negative and positive, to think of beyond the nation state. So most of the ways that Indigenous people have won any of some of the rights that we have, we inherently have, but still have to argue that we do. But thankfully, we're not arguing anymore. We're asserting in lots of ways. But a lot of that has happened because we go to an international sort of space to shame Canada into capitulating. The conversation between us and a nation state, and I mean this globally, most Indigenous people face this conundrum, is not going to necessarily work. Actually, I will say it will not work. I will just say that. And then I think of, in similar ways as what you were talking about, the global Indigenous space as an earth-based space. Thinking about earth-based philosophies and how they are women-centered philosophies, and how that seems to exist globally amongst our people, and how that's an important connection. I also think about global indigenous in terms of, and I'm not going to talk about the negative side of colonization right now, but in terms of a radical hospitality. So I think about where we are right now in the world, and I cannot sort of leave my fellow human beings behind in the world, meaning I think a lot about this concept of cities of refuge and this idea of radical hospitality to people who are being forcibly displaced. And I think as an Anishinaabe that my ancestors would be hospitable. And I have a responsibility to that, to what I think those values are. And I think about people who are facing like concrete walls that are being built, like across borders. And the way that is impacting Indigenous people globally. It's impacting, the border between the States and Mexico, between Palestine and Israel. It's happening all over the place. These intense borders, physical borders, not just conceptual, and the difference of a physical border versus a conceptual border. So I think those things right now. I'm going to stop there.
Charles.
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for being hospitable to have me on the panel.
We'll see how hospitable I'll be. No, just kidding.
You just promised. But I think in a sense that brings to one of the issues is the tendency for somebody coming from Europe, so coming from the origins of the invader ethnicity, the invader communities, which are represented in the majority here, means that there is always a tendency to speak within a kind of theoretical voice that overrides your own position and your own identity from that point of view, to become somebody who does not account for themselves as a European, because that European position is normalized to the extent that it becomes invisible. So in a strange way, the very invisibility that you were talking about plays in the opposite direction into the privileged normalcy of being a white male European, that white male Europeanness is spoken about in terms of an invisible privilege, a privilege which is not given word and given space. So I want to give that privilege, space and time in such a panel as this, but also I think in all of my activities as a curator and as a writer, that it's important, if this issue of global indigeneity or the global indigenous question mark is to mean anything, it has to also mean things in terms of my positioning globally in relation to the world. And I was interested when Jared said that he went to Santa Fe, to the academy there, to discover who he was, or that it had the process of discovering who he was. And I think that discovering who you are, discovering who I am, is something that we can share through life. That journey of life is something which on the individual basis is both necessary and perhaps even inevitable. So if global indigeneity is to mean something, it has to affect the sense of who I am and how I act. And when I think about that, I think about a narrative of my own biography in relationship to this question of global indigeneity, which has radically shifted because of the position and the conditions in which I live. And that's a position of, not to make it too complicated, of Western Europe. There's a complicated ethnicity behind, but I won't go into that. But a position in Western Europe, growing up towards the end of the Cold War, essentially in the 80s. I'm slightly younger than you are, Jen, but it's the 80s that I was growing up in, really.
Just as much white hair as I do.
I know, tragically. That's because we have a harder time.
I'm in a man-witch. I guess that makes me the meat.
And you like it, I know.
All the anxieties of middle age as well coming out. Middle-aged male. You see, that's something else that we can share. So there are certain commonalities that we can build slowly if we want to, and that wanting to is very important, I think. But what I'm conscious of is that growing up in that period towards the end of the Cold War, the main concern about discovering who I was related to the ideological battle that we were facing. Living in the American, and I think the United States, occupied part of Europe, facing the Soviet occupied part of Europe, and being very conscious, also because my family, most of them come from the Soviet occupied part, being very conscious of the differences and the problems which needed to be resolved between those two parts. And obviously the main way in which I understood those differences was through a Marxism, which I was brought up with because my parents were communists. So I was brought up with a Marxism that explained the world. And in that explanation of the world, there was very little space for the question of indigeneity. And when it did, or the indigenous, and when it did occur, it occurs, I mean, Lenin in the Third International talks about the indigenous in a roundabout way, but you have to look, in order to find it within that
I see it
discourse.
everywhere.
No, I mean within that discourse. Or
We are
specific
man in
references to
nature.
it. Yes, yeah. No, I mean
Yeah.
he does talk about the third world or the colonized peoples and the need to emancipate them at the same time as these emancipations are going on. So it's present, but I have to say that within the discussions that were happening in England or in Scotland at the time, which is where I was living, there wasn't very much presence of that argument. So perhaps it's in the literature, but it wasn't something which
That you
was present
discussed.
within the concept of the Cold War and how we resolve this Cold War and how we liberate ourselves from American oppression. That would have been essentially the discourse.
Right.
Or United States oppression, we should say. And through that process, the relationship that we might have with things like Wounded Knee or whatever, which happened a bit earlier, would be one of solidarity. That would be how it could be expressed. The idea that we would express support for that struggle without really feeling or knowing quite how to assist or help, or whatever patronizing terms we might have used, possibly to send some money, but more or less that was the engagement. So the engagement was one of solidarity, but also of difference, of our problems and their problems. And we could feel in solidarity, we could act to some extent in solidarity, but there was a split. So therefore, when the world changed in 1989 in Europe, and that change, of course, is both the invention of the internet, Tiananmen Square, and the beginnings of the global economy, and the end of the Cold War. So there are many changes around that period of the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. The emergence of globalization felt like a possibility, as you said, to escape from the nation state, but also perhaps a possibility to start to build something more than solidarity on an international level. To start to take account of the position of Europe as one part, one place in the world, and not the place in the world, which is how it had been projected and I think still to some degree, how internally our understanding of European education is passed down to the next generation. Mm-hmm. That this is the place, since the Renaissance at least, where not only art history but world history is determined. That's our understanding of ourselves. So when we discover who we are, we have to come to terms with that understanding and to discover it. So the question of the global had within it, at that time, I think, the possibilities of something that we were already calling the post-colonial. That the post-colonial was also a necessary element within that concept of what the global might mean. How those old imperial tracks could be turned against themselves in a certain way. And that was, of course, shaped by the presence of former colonial subjects, as they were understood, in the land of England and Scotland, particularly England, arriving since the end of the Second World War, so in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So your understanding of the post-colonial was mitigated through your neighbors who were also Indian, what's now called Pakistan, what's now called India, what's now called certain countries in Africa. and even what's called white Australian or white New Zealand or Maori. So those populations were present, also from the Caribbean. Those populations were present, and you understood them. And so the building of possible lines of solidarity started to get more complicated than just that single Marxist track, that Marxist analysis, which is what we had, at least I think is the only one. Of course, there was another track which was conformism and acceptance of the given rules, which was still the majority track, but I'm talking about this minority possibility. And so within the European position, this idea of the global indigenous with the question mark does or did represent the potential to escape from certain identitarian and dogmatic ideological possibilities which existed in the Europe of the 80s and to some extent still exist in the Europe of today. Mm-hmm. At the same time, that idea of the global indigeneity feeds completely into a conformist economic globalization, which we are all faced with, and something that we have to some extent in common, because there is more or less a single economic doctrine across most of the world. I know there are a few exceptions like North Korea and increasingly not Cuba, but previously Cuba. But nevertheless, if we look, 98% of the world's surface is governed by a single economic doctrine of neoliberalism. And that economic doctrine has huge consequences for all these relationships that we might try to build if we think about the relationship of global indigeneity as affecting our own identity. Because they're mediated through, the possibility that I'm sitting here is mediated through economic neoliberalism. So I have to be conscious again of the possibilities that the global offer and the possibilities of a discourse with indigenous thinking, while at the same time understanding that I'm subject to those economic doctrines. And what that led me to in my process of thinking was very much to the idea of that's really summed up by Walter Mignolo in terms of the idea of decoloniality. And the idea that it's possible to not move beyond the colonial, not talk about the post-colonial, because I think that's absurd. There's clearly still colonial conditions going on every day at every moment of our lives. But the decolonial as a form of thinking about how questions that are generated outside of that enclave of Western Europe, and it's always a part of Europe. Yeah, it's a part between the Algarve and the Shetland Islands or something. It's that strip of Europe that has had this meme of colonialism. There's also internal colonialism within Europe and towards the east. But that strip of colonialism needs also to be decolonized. The problem is that it's again, we come back to the problem that the colonial is very easily dismissed as either a special interest or as something that happens over there in the colonies. And what Mignolo taught me to understand was that there is an intimate, inseparable, completely singular concept of coloniality modernity. In other words, it is not possible to speak about modernity without talking and thinking at the same time about the colonial or coloniality. If you like, it's not possible to look at a Mondrian without thinking about the transatlantic slave trade. It's not possible to separate those two words. So what felt and feels like more of a challenge, if we take into account global indigeneity, is actually to think about what it would mean to start to promulgate within my practice and within discovering who I am, forms of demodernity, which feel much more challenging to the core identities of the Europe that I grew up in and that I still exist in. So in a sense, moving on from the decolonial, which I think is always problematic given the continued existence of colonialism and coloniality in 2016 and the likelihood that they will continue for a number of years to come. That is the demodern, a term that this global indigeneity might point us towards. And that's something that I'm quite interested in at the moment. And just to finish, I want to read a little section which tries, I think, to speak about Europe, in a way that I think helps me to discover who I am. And in discovering who I am, allows me to speak, I think, to the questions that you raised without trying to claim them for myself, without coming with this meta-theoretical position of the white, male, Western figure, but at the same time addresses a particularity that Europe has to deal with in its identity. And it's a short text, very short, I promise, by Eduardo Galeano, who's a Uruguayan writer. And it's called Euro Everything, and I'll just read it if I might, and then I'll finish. On his deathbed, Copernicus published the book that founded modern astronomy. 3 centuries before, Arab scientists Mujaddin al-Din al-Durdi and Nasir al-Din Tusi had come up with the theorems crucial to that development. Copernicus used their theorems, but did not cite the source. Europe looked in the mirror and saw the world. Beyond that lay nothing. The 3 inventions that made the Renaissance possible, the compass, gunpowder, and the printing press, came from China. The Babylonians scooped Pythagoras by 1500 years. Long before anyone else, the Indians knew the world was round and had calculated its age. And better than anyone else, the Mayans knew the stars, eyes of the night, and the mysteries of time. Such details were not worthy of Europe's attention. And I think that if we read and understand that a little bit, then the concept of global indigeneity played back to the European might be a very rich potentiality for our continued discussion on the local and the global level at the same time.
And just to interject for a sec, I think that it's interesting because it's like we have to, I guess I'm still very much a materialist in lots of ways, but it's like the philosophical underpinnings, but also the bodies and the pathways and the roots and all those kinds of things. So not just about your identity, but also the stake economically and all those kinds of things in the continued colonization, right, that Europe has.
Yeah, which is, I mean, extraction economies and things like that. But that's part of that global economic, which we're all wrapped up in as well, which we're also dependent upon in order to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. Which is what if we have to discover who we are, then that discovery is we can't avoid that. No, we can't avoid the complicity and also the horror of that realization.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I'm trying to understand, Charles, your use of a term, neoliberalism, and it's something that I've heard, but I really didn't know what it was. And I'm just trying to grapple with that notion of how it affects indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. As you indicated, how we're all sort of implicated by this particular idea, And so I was kind of interested in how you're using it, and perhaps consider, if I understood it properly, I wasn't sure if it meant a kind of responsibility or agency that it's given to us, a kind of individualism, an individuality in which we have responsibility and we have particular agency. I'm not sure if that's how I'm reading it, but there's a kind of a sense there that I thought was, and I'm trying to figure out if that actually can coexist with being indigenous, which is really about communities, and it's about, particularly in Canada, about group rights, and about reservations and, these large spaces of identity, and which kind of scares particularly Americans, because, it is a country based on individuality, whereas indigenous peoples are all communal. You talk about communism and Marx, and I don't know all that stuff, but I've read about it. Here we are as indigenous peoples living in our communities, with particular language and access to land and articulating. and we're kind of kept at a distance, and oh, they'll do their own thing. We're not really, we're not hurting anybody, we're not doing anything, we're just existing. So, and I'm wondering about the term, and how it operates, and whether or not, indigenous peoples live within that sensibility, that same driving force that we think of, as ourselves in terms of individuals and how we operate in the world. And so it's just this kind of conundrum of being indigenous while at the same time being a citizen of the world as an individual,
I mean, I think, to answer it quickly, I think that those forms of individuality are connected much more to modernity and so therefore are at stake in the question of the demodern than they are only to neoliberalism. They are part, absolutely, of neoliberalism, you're completely right, but they're also much bigger than neoliberalism. So I think they're also in many of the other, including actually many forms of Marxism, which is also a very modern ideology. So the issue of neoliberalism alone is, I think, simply said, and there are many forms, it's an economic system essentially developed through the Chicago school. And in some senses, it's little more than that, because it relies upon an economic logic which overwhelms any other logic without necessarily denying the other logics, but just saying it's irrelevant, because it's a pure pragmatism. So as a pragmatic ideology, in a way, it simply says, but these are the economic realities in which we live. And I think that's what I meant when I said that we're all under its dogma, if you like, under its doctrine, as Homo economicus. We are buying and selling in supermarkets that are not buying, basically consuming with whatever little or great amount of resources we have. We're consuming within that economy, and we're contributing to that circulation. So, and it's very hard to see how you might step out of that, but certainly kind of forms of subsistence and things like that do step out of it. There are exceptions to it, but there's a big part of the world that's very much part of that, and it's not something which we can step out of. We need to recognize it.
Can we
I'm going to interject in between
Wanda a little
here.
bit of space here to speak about maybe the indigenous?
I'll take my
local?
space,
Yeah.
don't worry, I was listening. I kind of want to come, I guess, in between you. Oh God, places I could go with that one. But thinking, okay, so what I'm hearing coming from you and what I'm hearing coming from you, one, we're all complicit, and you're trying to say, actually, there might be limits to that complicity where indigenous people are concerned. And I would say, I would mark indigenous in that moment out as a something that some of us live and not all of us do as indigenous people. So some are intensely bought in and are complicit in the neoliberal project and in capitalism in general and in the extractive economy, and they are indigenous people who've signed on to that project for whatever reason. Being poor for hundreds of years really sucks. But I think for me, indigenous has to mean somewhat of what you're talking about in terms of thinking about land communally, thinking about being that capitalism's last stand. So I think actually capitalism and I'll say capitalism and dispense with neoliberalism for now, because that's the underlying thing. That capitalism, there are the people who actually suffer from its operation, even though they buy and sell in the supermarket. And so there has to be distinctions. And I think in many ways, the indigenous, as much as it is a concept that washes away the differences between us as Anishinaabe, as all the different nations that we are, I think that is the common stance, or I hope, is that we will be there saying, no, you're not going any further. Capitalism won't come here. This is absolutely not going to happen. So I think there has to be, indigenous for me marks that space, and it is global in that sense because it's happening everywhere. And actually there's more people suffering from it than there are benefiting from it globally. So yeah, so for me it's like complicity, I don't know, not necessarily.
Can you maybe kind of keep pushing a little bit more? You talked about the body, both in roots and routes. And what for you then, I mean, in a way, it was kind of provocative to throw out the global to start. But maybe we can take a step back and continue that conversation about the indigenous and how much of the concept or the being of someone or a nation is located in the local. Versus these bridges we talk about or the global situation. I mean, I think we'll get through that again. We'll come back to it throughout the whole conversation tonight. But maybe we can take a step back at this point and just talk about what you think is necessitated by the local in relation to this concept.
Well, it's like there's a number of things. Like if you, just to be base about it in some ways, but also I think it's not base. Like if you were to map out all the areas of pollution, right, that comes from any mining site, any nuclear reactor, they're all in indigenous territories. It's all indigenous bodies that are suffering the generations of cancer and all that kind of stuff. So there's a real bodily, physical shit that we're dealing with. So there's that. Also, I think the economies are mapped on our territories, and you talked about having land. It's like we do not have land. We have 2% of Canadian land, and we have like 100% of Canada's poverty. So it's like, and there is a direct relationship. And I've known this, but Art Manuel speaks about it way better than I could. In his book Unsettling Canada, which everyone should read, but very much makes the case about access to land and who owns land and where wealth resides and how wealth is distributed, and that there is a direct relationship between indigenous poverty and how much land we do not have. Yeah, which is not to say that if we get the land, we're going to do extractive economy and then we're going to become wealthy. Actually, I think that's the scary part for people, is that they're hoping that indigenous people will make that choice, right? So you give us free prior informed consent or these kinds of things, the underlying message is that you won't say no, right? So as long as we give you whatever consultative process that we give you or that kind of thing, that indigenous people will be smart and just take the money and go, right? So, and I would say that after 500 years of colonization, it is difficult to say no. You can't fucking judge people who don't say no, and people who do piss me off. But at the same time, I will hold people accountable to say no, or to work on the processes. And this is where the body becomes an important part of resurgent practices and things like this. Is that these things live in our bodies, and we have to work it out through our bodies in all the different ways that we do, politically, artistically, communally, like getting violence out of our communities, all these kinds of things, without ever losing sight of the process of putting your body on the line. Our bodies are already on the line. We're the ones who are incorporating all that negative pollution and pain and all that kind of shit into our bodies to make other people wealthy. So, again, we're asked to put our bodies on the line. I think we want some other bodies besides our own there with us. I don't know if I'm going where you want me to go, but
Go wherever you want. Either of you have a question in regards to that versus global?
Well, I think the local and global, I think, is what you're talking about.
are you saying I didn't?
There's a project I'm working on right now. I'm just embarking on a project with a chap from Sydney, University of Sydney. He's Aboriginal Australian. we're working with two communities. We're just beginning to talk with these communities. And there are two communities that are isolated. They have a community of artists. They are internationally known. None of the artists have ever been to art school, and none of the people seem to leave their community. Why? You know, this is the kind of questions that we're trying to consider. These two communities, one, as Canadians, you're all familiar with Cape Dorset, you know, up in Nunavut. The other one is in the central desert of Australia called Papunya. I don't know if anybody knows Central Australia. But here are these two art-making communities, to bring the discussion back to art and the practice of these individuals and communities. And we're interested in these questions of why, you know, the why. Obviously, they're located in particular areas in the remotest parts of the world, like, you know, how many people want to live up in the far north? We know a lot of Canadians don't, new Canadians. Or in the central desert of Australia, you know, but that's where indigenous peoples are. They've learned that is home. You know, I know a lot of Inuit would say, people will go, why you live in such, you know, disastrous places like that? You know, shouldn't you be in Florida and the Caribbean and that? And why do you want to live in the snow? You know, why do you want to live in such harsh conditions? And I think these are some of the questions that we're interested in. How do we live in these places? Why do we live in these places? Years ago, a friend of mine was asked, he was asked, so talking about this question of indigeneity and identity at the time, indigenous wasn't really a term of being used at the time. Indian was the term that we were using at the time. So he was asked, he said, so how do you define Indian, you know? And I think this is quite interesting for us all. And he said, well, an Indian is someone whose roots are at least 6 feet into the earth. I thought of that in all these years, and I thought there's something profoundly interesting about that idea that a definition is something that simple, you know, unlike the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, who have a very interesting definition of indigenous peoples, but something metaphoric is having roots planted so far deep into the earth, you know, that's who we are. And I think fundamentally that was a question we're interested in the kind of the ontologies of the indigenous peoples in a globalized world, and how does that operate? I think that those are the questions that we're interested in. On the other hand, you have a country like Canada, as I said earlier, 1.5 to 2 million indigenous peoples in Canada that are First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, of which about 60% of that are First Nations. So I don't know what that works out to, several hundred thousand or just over 1 million First Nations. But of that, over 50% live in urban areas. You know, we've all moved to Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, whatever, every city across the country. My sense is that the definition of what indigeneity on that global level is quite different, you know, because a lot of them are born and raised in urban areas. You know, there's no, you know, we can only talk about the land, but we don't live on the land. You know, it's only an intellectual exercise, you know, that's vastly different than, say, the Inuit and other people that live on the land. So I think the dimensions are quite different, and I think it's a struggle. But yet we want to retain a kind of sense of indigeneity as we live in these urban areas, you know. How do we pass that on, you know? What is it to be indigenous in an urban area? And I think that there's a sense that we maintain and are being what's passed on to us are a sense of the kinds of deep principles of what it means to be indigenous, I think are important. We have to carry something into the future, and I think it's a question I think that I'm also interested in about these kind of urban indigenous identities. What are they in relation to someone that lives on the land, let's say? So anyhow, that's kind of my look at kind of how the local and the global perhaps operate, and I think it's much more complicated than that.
Do you want to quickly say
Yeah, I
something,
think
Charles?
there's also the in my experience, in the urban space and rural spaces and reserve spaces, it's like it doesn't really divide that way that land-based people are on the reserve and non-land-based people are in the city. Like, it's totally not exactly like that anymore. Maybe it was at a certain point, but I think it's a little different. But I agree with you that people who are making their livelihood and their food and all that kind of stuff coming from the land, which sometimes is urban people too, it's that's what I'm talking about as a specific space that needs to be protected.
It's a question, because you brought up Australia, so I wondered whether there are exchanges or useful exchanges or strategies that can be shared between those people who describe themselves as indigenous or are described as indigenous by the UN or whatever, but the people that you come across who you feel a certain kinship with because of certain histories, in this case British colonialism, for instance, which is essentially the same action that occurs in these two hugely different parts of the world with hugely different cultures. I mean, I'm thinking about, for instance, the sovereignty campaign that is being started in amongst the Indigenous Australian community, and the passport that has been issued over the last 10 years or so, where they've been trying to travel on the passport, and with some success, not much success. Whether those kinds of strategies of claiming sovereignty, of issuing a statement saying it's not that we want to be recognized by Australia, we want to not have Australia as part of our identity. We want not to engage with it at all. Is that something that can inspire or can connect, or is the distance and the differences impossible to bridge? In the sense that the global indigeneity could one form of it could be those kind of strategies leaking from one place to another.
They already have the Haudenosaunee passport here, and they've had it forever. They've actually, the Australians came here, and they visited Akwesasne, and they saw the Haudenosaunee passports, and then that's what started them doing their passports. So that connection's already there.
Well,
Another term that was thrown around.
It was a very, very cool thing.
But is that a positive, I suppose? or is it kind of irrelevant to what we're talking about?
I think, no, it's not irrelevant at all. It depends, like and I'm one of these people who has dual citizenship by force. So I didn't choose Canada, and I didn't choose that kind of conglomerate to be on top of me. And I think that even though we call ourselves citizens, we can't forget that we're still wards of the state under the law. And we do tend to forget that as we travel the globe and as we stand in auditoriums like this, and you've got a great career behind you, you can do anything you want now. But still legally, we're still wards. No, it's not totally true, but it's more true than others, right? But we're still wards of the state. And also, I think what's relevant is that is the laws of this land. The law of this land was, that Canadian laws were not supposed to be placed on our people. So we are supposed to be living according to our own traditions and our own legal basis and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's completely relevant to what I'm talking about. And I think, like we talked about the other night, why I don't like modernisms, like alternative modernisms, or adding an S to modernisms. It's like it's all one big, massive colonial project that we are totally central to. We're totally central to modernity, not marginal, actually. So in a similar vein, holding these things that some people have given up on and some people still fight for, and some people just live by as if Canada doesn't exist. All of these strategies, I think, are extremely important, and your de-modernity project would be impossible without these alternatives.
Sure, yeah, for sure.
To kind of continue that, a lot of stuff's been thrown of demodernization or modernization. A buzzword for the last few years has been decolonization. You've already mentioned it this evening. The last couple of years, I've really been learning the complicated nature of what that word really means, and the very fractured understanding of what that word is. Like the last few years with some of my colleagues like Shine Turin's or Zoe Todd, who was here last week, really kind of expressing the problematics of perhaps a buzzword like that. I mean, even here at the University of Toronto, we have a journal called On Decolonization here at the school. So I'm wondering, with this type of language, what is the problematics as much as the possibilities of using that term being absorbed? I mean, Zoe does talk about indigenizing the Anthropocene and this appropriation of indigenous cosmologies, of certain strategies. So as much as we want to talk about bridges between certain things, I'm wondering if we can take a moment to perhaps be reflective on the aspect of what is the danger of using these words within these projects of indigenizing an institution or decolonizing a way of being or a state or an institution itself.
Me too.
Whoever wants to bite.
Well, two of the immediate dangers I see is one, that it builds an industry of people who will make profit from the process and industry of indigenizing and reconciling and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not sure that it will go to the underlying structural shifts that are necessary. I think the other danger is that I'm not sure that people know what they're talking about when they do that process.
That's a tough question. Decolonizing, yeah.
Have you decolonized your mind? Remember that, that was a huge thing, and it still is important, don't get me wrong. But what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
Did you go through a process of trying to decolonize your mind?
Well, I think we, back in, all remember 1992?
No.
Well, 1492, yeah. The Columbus quincentennial. Charles, you might.
I remember.
As a European, you're familiar
We were
with
celebrating
that.
away. Yeah.
Everybody was celebrating. The whole world was celebrating. The Americans were celebrating, but Columbus didn't go to the U.S., he was somewhere in the islands. Canada was actually celebrating as well, but the Canadians weren't celebrating the Columbus quincentennial. It was just happened to be the 125th birthday of our country, of this country, Canada. But the indigenous peoples were not celebrating. They were the only ones, certainly, that weren't celebrating. And that was a momentous occasion. When we think about it, kind of a form of decolonization, I think, was about trying to find voice, and how do you fight for voice? I talked about Wounded Knee, about discovering voice and what that was. And I thought, and I think that part of that process, for us, we were all young artists and curators back in those days, because up until then, these institutions we talked about really spoke on our behalf. They represented us, they spoke about who we were, and basically we were voiceless. I talked earlier about this possibility of that moment was one of ventriloquism, where somebody is speaking on your behalf. We're just the puppets. It's really not our minds, but we may just say the right words, and there was a lot of ventriloquism going on. But 1992 was an opportunity for the arts community, the indigenous arts community in Canada, to do an exhibition about an anti-colonial, an anti-quincentennial exhibition. And it was an opportunity we did, and I think we did it. And incidentally, we called it indigena or indigena. You know, we're talking about indigeneity. And it was the first time, and we did this interestingly in a museum in Ottawa. And but what was interesting about that was we had gathered indigenous artists, Indian at the time, First Nations, Inuit and Métis artists together, writers and performers, and we published a catalog that's certainly, you know, that's available. And usually these catalogs have the foreword by the director of the museum, you know, as a, you know, all, Charles, you're a director, you probably write in all your catalogs, you know, for your curators, right, and all that.
Yeah, they write. Well, I write.
They write, but you write the introduction, or
I try to avoid doing
right.
that.
You try to avoid. Anyway, that's what most directors do. You're slipping in your job, I guess. You know?
I'm not very good.
So the director of the day was Dr. George MacDonald, and I approached George. I said, "Look, we can't have your voice in here, you know, because it's not. The whole point is that it's our voice. You know, if you said something that would defeat the whole purpose, you know, we'd go back to the Ventriloquism Act again." And so he said, "Well, fine, I understand." So that was to me a very critical moment of trying to, I think, if that's the term of decolonizing, of trying to change a kind of the system from the inside and try to look at alternatives, you know. And I know at the same time in the early 90s, I was involved with other museums across Canada, with other Indigenous communities, to change the landscape within the museum community. And we put out a report called the Task Force on Museums and First Nations, which was a very important report, because again, it goes back to notions of interpretation, who's interpreting for us, or in other words, who's the voice, you know, we want it to be be the voice ourselves. We want to interpret ourselves, basically. They talked about access, you know, about museums. And I think access goes even further to actually employing individuals, indigenous peoples within the institutions. And there's still a lack of that today. And thirdly, it was about repatriating materials back to communities, whether it's in Canadian, American, or other global institutions. But repatriation was very much a part of that. So these are the kinds of the terms of perhaps a process, maybe a decolonial process, you know, that I can immediately think about. And I think also another part of the process was when we talk about a decolonial process, we have to talk about the strategies for changing, you know, changing the conditions in which we're in. And I think some of the artists began doing that. You know, when we think of artists on the Northwest Coast along British Columbia, Charles, it's along the British Columbia. And a lot of those artists today have been returning back to those communities, you know. They're starting to make objects and things for their communities. They're not just making it for the art market, for the big museums of the world, but they're going back to make stuff for themselves. They're putting up totem poles, you know, these big poles. They're making masks for dancing, because sometimes they can't repatriate the stuff. The old stuff is old. That's long ago. We want to make new stuff, you know. I'm also reminded of an artist, the late Carl Beam, who many of you might know. And Carl, I think for years, lived in Peterborough, Ontario. But he moved back eventually to West Bay, Ontario, which is on Manitoulin Island. And Carl, you know, to me, I always like to say he was an artist's artist. You know, I thought the way he talked, the way he practiced, just the way he lived his life was really quite phenomenal. Because he started, and I don't think anybody took him seriously, but he moved back to the community and started building his own house, and he was trying to influence others to build their houses the way he was. And how was he building his house? He took these bales, these hay bales, you know, and started constructing his house. You know, it's sustainable, it's warm, it's everything, you know. But it took kind of an artistic idea or a practice, in order to think that way. And I think that his mind was there, and decolonizing, I think, what was happening with the rest of the Indian country. He wanted to do that on his own. So I think there are various strategies that were being engaged by indigenous peoples to look at this. We can shout, we can do all sorts of things to critique colonialism. We can lie down and just accept it, or we can do something. And I think those artists were doing something about it, and I think that's what, to me, was really cool, Yeah.
I mean, maybe I can try and come at it from a sideways point of view, because I think it's not easy to talk about it. It has to talk about it from my own experience, and that has to then be again grounded in Europe, because otherwise I think it's an invalid situation. So I think that the decolonial is obviously, or the decolonizing is obviously a problematic concept, because there's still existing colonialism going on. So we cannot ignore that in this process of getting carried away with the decolonial. At the same time, I think part of its proposal, at least, is a proposal of a way of thinking about our history, and that's our history being the history of the colonialists, the history of the invaders, and of seeing how we can refocus the thinking that exists within those communities so that it takes on board the colonial crimes, the colonial actions that have occurred over the last 500 years. And that's, of course, that's quite a hard journey. And the way that I can most easily sort of relate it in terms of meaning to the European project is to think about another form of trying to remove a certain element from thinking in Europe, which was the process of denazification, which happened after the Second World War. And I mean, I think you see immediately the difference between decolonial thinking and post-colonial thinking if you apply that to the difference between denazification and post-nazification. Post-nazification would be a kind of acceptance of what had happened and then a continuation without it. Denazification is a process of trying to, and however incomplete the process was, however problematic the process was, I'm defending it as a process that was better than nothing. It was better than not having denazification, but it wasn't completed. But that's less the point than the efforts that were made in Central Europe to try and create conditions where people were aware of the crimes that had been committed during the Second World War. And remember, those crimes are essentially colonial crimes. I mean, essentially what happens in the Second World War is that actions which are carried out by European empires in the rest of the world are imported back into Europe. And the reason they are so shocking is because Europeans can't believe that they were applied to their own people in a certain way, however much their own people was also attempted to be divided. But essentially, they're the same movements. The idea of genocide is learned, and this is, you can prove this in the documents. This is learned in South Africa through British imperial rule, and then imported back, and industrialized to a certain degree, and increased, and made slightly more efficient, and things like that. But essentially, that's how it's learned. So it's not so irrelevant to compare decolonial thinking to acts of denazification, and I think that is how the decolonial can be useful, while taking account of all the problematics that you mentioned around the fact that it might be a way of avoiding the fact that colonialism still exists. Because obviously the advantage of denazification was there wasn't a community which was still celebrating it or still applauding it. And I think that's less true with the question of the decolonial.
I would argue that might actually, inversely, that your example is actually an example of how thinking about decolonization, which is already thinking of it in that way, is not effective, as you see the rise of fascism again in Europe, and particularly you see even the eradication at the level of the government of the Nazis completely out of power, which in this case, the same government still is in power even. So I would argue that argument articulates kind of the inverse of what you're saying personally.
But also it takes away from the very everydayness of colonialism and its thinking, you know, like in a way.
Yeah, I'm not
Like-
I'm not trying to deny anything through that process. I'm trying to suggest that there's a certain exercise that maybe needs to happen in Europe in terms of addressing its colonial past.
Right.
And we can try and not do that, of course. We can try and ignore it, but ignoring it produces the very fascism that you're talking about, I think. Because, you know, one of the significant elements in European politics at the moment is that idea of never again, which was a commitment that was made in 1945, has become more or less meaningless in many cases. And that's very hard for us. You know, there's a great darkness in Europe at the moment because of that. And so processes of denazification maybe are relevant again to think about. And it's not certainly not trying to say that the colonial is like the Nazi and that it doesn't exist anymore. I said that. But nevertheless, to say, can Europe deal with its colonial past? I think that's an issue for Europeans that we can't ignore. It doesn't detract from any other actions. It's not a universal panacea. It's a very, very local issue. And maybe the decolonial has more significance there than it does elsewhere.
There's an interesting situation right now because of the events in Syria, which I think are apropos almost to the discussion here about what's happening in Europe because of all the refugees coming in. I was, earlier this year, I think it was last fall, I'm working on another project with a curator in Dresden, in Germany. It's in the old eastern part of Germany. And we're doing an exhibition on indigenous views of the other, which is primarily about Europeans, basically. So that's the exhibition, that's the idea. So anyhow, I was at a hotel right downtown in the middle of Dresden, waiting to have a drink, because we talked all day, and so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden in the hotel, there's all these policemen coming in and out of the, you know, I thought, oh, are they staying here or using the bathroom to take a piss, you know? They were just coming in and out. And both male and female police officers were coming in, and pretty soon there was just like a lot of them. So the party arrived, and I said, what's going on here? And they said, don't you know, it's Monday night in Dresden, you know? And they said, it's Pegida night.
Oh.
Pegida started in Dresden. Which is, I don't know, you might be able to explain Pegida better to the audience than I can, but it's the kind of an anti-Islamification of Europe or something like that.
Yeah, it's the protection of Western values, actually, literally,
Yeah.
the evening land, as it's called.
So we had an interesting discussion that night because it was quite scary, you know, because thousands and thousands of local Dresden types were marching. They had the flags, and I thought, was this the case during the Second World War in the 30s that was going on, when you had thousands of people sort of rallying, while at the same time there were less numbers who were protesting the Pegida, they were blowing whistles. So there was this very interesting that was going on that night. And so I watched this for a while, and it was quite scary to be sort of wrapped up in it. And I thought, as a person coming from far, far away and hearing the chants, and there was a kind of a fear, just almost palpable, that I was sitting there thinking, what if I got caught up in it? What if somehow something happened? But nothing happened, of course, but it was really I don't know, there's the question of otherness started to become important to us, about refugees coming into Germany, changing the kind of complexion of that part. That's what the fear was, and I go, there's a kind of colonialism perhaps of the refugees that they felt were settled. I don't know, these are questions to me that are...
I'm going to pull rank here for a second as a moderator and really open it up to the floor. I mean, we started a little late, but I want to have at least the last an hour of conversation, like an hour, a half hour, something for the folks. It's been really great people that really want to speak. So we got Dwayne and Ronaldo there in the back.
First, please.
You need to go.
So I'm a little bit troubled by the conversation. Just let me be frank. And being
thought you were
troubled by the
Ronaldo.
conversation, I want to put pressure on two words. I'm interested in what are the itineraries and the cartographies of the global that are being marked here. And I'm also interested in what are the itineraries and the cartographies of the indigenous that's being marked here. Is indigeneity only understood as in relationship to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand? Or is there African indigenous?
Not what I said. I'm safe in this
for the
question.
two guys in particular, for Jared and Charles.
I was good.
Or does indigeneity exist outside of Europe's satellite colonies? Are the Zulus indigenous? Are the Maasai indigenous? What other kind of cartographies of global indigeneity might we register that might help us to do something about how we think about what's at stake in this moment? And furthermore, is indigeneity just a noun or is it a verb? Like, when do we become indigenous? Right? Can we become indigenous to a place that we don't belong? As Jamaica Kincaid once asked. Like, what exactly are we speaking about? And in terms of Charles, in terms of Europe, right? How do the Roma go missing so easily?
Sir?
How do the Roma go missing so easily? What are the itineraries that are marking this conversation? And what are the elisions and silences and repeated violences embedded in this conversation that we're not accounting for?
I mean, I first raised the mapping of like contemporary extraction out of Africa, out of South America, all of that, on top of contemporary, that is the global mapping on colonial roots, right? So, and it's quite, anyway, I said a bunch more things, but you guys go defend yourselves.
I hope the Roma didn't disappear. I was trying, and I said that there's a particular part of Europe. Okay, then they shouldn't have disappeared, and nor should certain internal colonizations that have happened within Europe disappear as well. And I don't know whether that term indigenous can be applied to those situations, because I think that's something that the Roma themselves would have to determine. No, not me. But it wouldn't be something that I would disallow in some way at all. And I think it was more the drift of the conversation that went in the direction of Australia than any intention to classify that as being the indigenous, certainly not from my point of view. But I wouldn't want to define it. I mean, I would like it to be mapped, but I wouldn't want to map it here myself, no.
That's a too easy answer. That's the way in which a certain white, liberal, progressive, male response is now to say, my position is not a map anymore, as a kind of way of saying I'm doing a radical politic or progressive politic.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, your responsibility should be saying, this is how we mapped it. These are the ways in which we can move. These are the itineraries that are shaping how I'm speaking here. And this is the problematic position that I speak, as opposed to the easy slip of the yoke of, I will map it. Right? It's ethic and relationship to power.
No, okay, no, I think it's fair.
It's really beautiful, fluent speech, but it doesn't do the deep-rooted politics that's necessary.
Okay, I think that's fair enough. I'm not going to argue with you there. I do think that trying to speak about Europe here is quite difficult, but I think it's also necessary, and I think that's part of that move towards it, rather than to talk about the indigenous from my position. I'm trying to talk about what this condition is in Europe that we might need to deal with. And I think that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story, and to ask me to map the whole story feels wrong to me, but maybe that's incorrect.
Well, we talked about the Second World War, right? So, well, I didn't talk about it, but you brought that up. I mean, there's a number of things directions we could have went into, like thinking about the partition, you know? That's that time. If we think about the putting of a nation on Palestine, if we think about there are so many things that happened right in that time period that actually, if you start mapping it outside of communism versus America, then the cartography becomes very different. I think that's what you're pushing at a little bit, which is your responsibility too, right? Because Europe is there. Europe is like...
But Europe is everywhere.
And we talk about, like, in some ways, this sort of, like, I stand behind the United Nations in lots of ways, but at the same time, it did some damage then, and it is, we do have to think outside nation states, which is a very difficult thing. And even the word human means of man, right? So, and it was men sitting at that table at that time. So it's like, there's a bunch of shit we could have talked about, even in terms of Second World War and global situations we currently find ourselves in. And even in the Syrian example you used, I mean, we really could talk about...
But we can't also ignore that situations in Africa during the time of the Cold War were also very much determined by that ideological divide. Battles and liberation struggles in Angola or in Mozambique also had the role of Israel and Palestine, also had huge elements of that, not exclusively, it's not 100%, but we can't take the ideological battle of the Cold War out of that and understand it without that.
That's not what I'm saying.
So it's both and. It's not something that we can ignore, that was the core divide, which also divided much of the world.
We can look at Afghanistan, we can look at Iraq, like we can look at so many things.
Well, Ronaldo, right?
In that vein.
My answer is not to avoid answering. I didn't put this panel together, and I'm only speaking from kind of a Canadian Indigenous perspective. And some parts of the world where I've haven't been to visit other parts of the world, but I agree. I think it is a slippery slope of creating a cartography of who is here first kind of thing, And I think they're trying to define that kind of prior occupancy and who owns the particular land and all that is a slippery slope. And I mean, I'm quite interested in some of the so-called indigenous peoples in other parts of the world. I understand there's even indigenous peoples in India who are aboriginal to India. There are aboriginal peoples everywhere. And the Samis in Northern Europe is a very interesting case, But we can, if we talk about this notion of a kind of indigeneity of going back to time immemorial, it gets even fuzzier, and more difficult to define who are indigenous. But I think part of the problem that I think we've been trying to wrestle, and I think people are wrestling about, is about that occupancy and a kind of what happened after colonization took place, And I know in Africa and other countries like that, there are moments of what they would probably call a post-colonial, of chasing the original colonizers out. But that's a situation we cannot be in the Americas, We're colonized forever. So there's a peculiar moment that we're in, and I think that's something that is difficult to come to terms with, And I think we're always going to talk about it, but at the same time, are we going to talk about it forever, or are we going to create another way of coming to terms with it, strategizing opportunities and seeing the potentials of what that means? I mean, obviously, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I just thought
Well, you sparked something, we're all trying to think out loud, but just in terms of thinking about, I just don't understand indigenous without understanding land, and I don't understand indigenous without understanding, the fight against a certain kind of economic colonialism that's still continuing, which connects the continent of Africa to, to this concept of indigenous, not just because of cultures being indigenous, but also because our fights are now joined, After a certain mapping has been made, our fights are now joined. It's almost, there's similar fights in lots of ways. We're all fighting a similar thing.
Hi, it's me, Dwayne.
Hi, Dwayne.
Hi. There's a couple of things that I wanted to sort of talk about. The first is and it's not only occurring in this place; it's occurring all over. Is the use of the word decolonization and the sort of push to use that word, and it seems like there's an agenda there. And I sense that there's an agenda with the push of that word, especially when white folks are pushing that agenda. Why I feel, and have always felt skeptical about the word itself. And for a long, long time, I wasn't sure why, right? I wasn't sure, but I just felt very, very unsure about this term and the ideas that are sort of within it. So recently, like it's becoming more and more apparent that why my discomfort of using that word and the ideas associated with that word is that it recenters, where it recenters whiteness, but it also claims to sort of center indigeneity at the same time. So I think there's a huge contradiction in that word, where I don't want to center whiteness anymore. I'm tired of centering whiteness in institutions, in these spaces, in discussions. I think, as I said today, that my primary agenda, if you want to use that word for myself, are my relationships with other indigenous people. That's my primary goal. That's what I want to do. And other relationships can come after that. And so why I feel that this word of decolonization is being pushed into conflict with my own ideas of where I want to center my relationships and who I want to center. I want to center in indigenous people, indigenous bodies at the center of these conversations. Whiteness can come much later, right? Also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the question of global indigenous as a question itself. I was reminded of a paper that Marcia Crosby wrote. What is this paper called? Construction of Imaginary Indian, where in the paper itself, she talks about a professor, who I'm assuming that is white, asks her questions about her identity that she cannot answer back. Right? I think this sort of her inability and the openness of her inability to fulfill such a question is a really, really important position, a contemporary position of being indigenous right now. And so this question right now, it seems like it seems that I cannot fulfill it. That I cannot fulfill if there's such a thing as global indigenous or not. I've seen many propositions in the forms of exhibitions that propose these things, but it doesn't. I don't feel like it's fulfilled, and now I'm beginning to wonder if it ever will be.
I'm also uncomfortable with the word decolonization, but I also don't detract from people who use it and have used it well, and it's meaningful to them, indigenous and non-indigenous. There are dangerous ways it's being used, for sure, and we have to demarcate out those strategies from each other. But I can understand it through somebody like Fanon. That makes sense to me.
These are different situations, though, right?
And I can understand. I'm just talking from myself, right? Like, I'm not talking for anyone else right now, personally, and politically, and curatorially, and artistically, and all those things. And I also understand it through this idea of unwinding ourselves from the white words we've become, right? And what the hell is that, right? And so to presume that we don't have to do that is a problem, too. That is part of what needs to be done, and then, but we can't get stuck there either, because we're creators, right? We're creative beings fundamentally as Anishinaabe. So then I think of, we are what we imagine of ourselves. The greatest tragedy who can befall us is to go unimagined. So that's the project of creating, right? You're doing some of that work. Everybody, we're involved in that activity of actively creating these spaces that I call Anishinaabe, right? Like, I call myself indigenous in public contexts, or in certain contexts where we have to talk as an entity beyond me as Anishinaabe. But I do think indigenous also has to, I guess I'm making the proposition that it has to mean land, and it has to mean, like, if you're going to claim that, it has to mean something to do with colonial economies and how they continue and the fight against that, which would mean denying indigenous to certain folks. Not that I want to be a part of that. But anyway, it's a provocation, it's a call. It's not necessarily a label or a thing that actually exists in the world. But then there are elders who say it does exist, because if you study indigenous cultures globally, and they travel around and they meet each other and they find so much in common culturally, spiritually, blah, blah, blah. So there's a way of thinking indigenous in that context too, but that's ours, I think. That doesn't belong to anyone else, right? So that's another creative, imaginative space that we're building. Yeah, so I think we do need to do the unwinding from the white words we've become as part of this great imagining that we're doing.
Maybe time for one or two more questions.
Oh, and I was quoting there Gerald Visner, so you don't think I'm so great and poetic. Gerald Visner on unwinding ourselves from the white words we've become. And then not Silko, but the other one. The one.
There it is.
No, it is Leslie Marmon Silko, who talked about the greatest tragedy that can befall us is to go unimagined.
So, thank you to all the panelists. I apologize if it seems like I'm just, tacking on the critical feedback that you are getting here, but I do want to comment on the fact that, when I first heard about this event and read the event description on Facebook and everything, I was quite excited about it because I thought, we would cover areas where I myself, as an immigrant, it could be relevant to me vis-a-vis understanding the whole, indigenous movements and all of those things. And I felt like that was a bit lacking. I also felt like there's a lack of representation on the panel of people of color or, people from the global south or whatever you want to call it. And I think, that needs to be pointed out, especially in the context of how, for instance, we have just witnessed the Black Lives Matter Toronto tent city, happening just a few blocks away from us, and there was this incredible display of solidarity between the Black community and Indigenous peoples. And I think, anyways, I think there will also be other brilliant people who can speak about all these ways that global Indigenous movement, whatever that means, can intersect and play out in Canada. And so I don't like to put you on the spot, Mr. Esche, but I think you can take it. So we have this situation where we have a professor or a curator all the way from Europe who's invited to this panel, but we have local people here in Toronto who I think could also speak about this issue from a person of color or a visible minority or whatever kinds of backgrounds that they belong to in a way. And I think that would have been relevant for me, personally speaking. So that's one thing. The other comment was, on this topic of global indigeneity, I'm a Tibetan, so I know that my people back in Tibet are resisting occupation of their lands by China. And when we talk about, for instance, when Ms. Nanibush speaks about how economic capitalism and economic coloniality plays out, it also plays out in the form of Canadian mining companies in Tibet extracting resources, pilfering them without any benefit, without any consideration for local indigenous populations or for the environment. So I do echo your point of emphasis on that point. So that's the reason I'm pointing it out is because we do lots of, for instance, I used to be an activist and we would do protest movements and whatnot in Canada. But lately, I've also come to understand that it's important for the different kind of, occupation resistance movements, whether you're a Tibetan, whether you're Palestinian, Ukrainian, Tamil, whoever, to also acknowledge at the same time that we live on colonized, stolen lands. And apart from just, making, let's say, a statement at the onset of a demonstration, are there other ways that, we can build a more fulsome solidarity between these different communities? Is that important for the indigenous peoples here in North America? And if so, how can you strengthen that bond? So that's all.
Does anyone want to respond to that, or should I?
Well, I just wanted to say, I want to not defend you, but I do. We have this problem of saying, like, we're pissed off when white people don't say anything because it's also their problem, but then we're also pissed off when they do say something. So it's like at some point, maybe you're dissatisfied with what was said, but I think the presence is not necessarily the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to speak from the point of view of a white person, which I'm not sure is valid for you, and I completely respect that, and I'm happy to, I would be happy not to be here, yeah? But...
Especially right now.
It's just that
I'm not sure whether...
We're in the context of an art
this
situation.
movement, if there is a movement, Europe, and obviously that's part of the settler culture profoundly, yeah, but I'm talking about, the family who stayed, the other ones that didn't go, the losers, if you like. That within Europe, I think it's not wrong to think of it as a part of the world. In other words, not to simply eliminate it from these discussions. So I agree with you completely about the diversity of this group is wrong, yeah? That it should be much more diverse. But within that diversity, I think in order for it to be meaningful, maybe a European voice should also be there alongside those others and not eliminated from it. So that would be the only marginal point of defense that I might have towards my presence here. But I agree that there's not enough others aside from us three.
I'm going to take a little bit of credit for that. I mean, I mainly, or partly organized the panel, so I should take the brunt for that. But I do want to say that today's conversation is the end of a day-long conversation that did include people, and I wish there were more voices, and there will be more voices. I don't think this is the end of a conversation. Hopefully today was the beginning of a conversation. And I know there's probably tons of burning questions out there, but I know I've already gone over significant time with you guys. So I would encourage people to have a question to come forward after the talk to maybe quickly ask a question and engage with people on a one-on-one. Might be more productive as well. But again, thank you to the audience for being here this evening and asking great questions. Thank you to all of you three coming, and I'll give the last word to Gerald.
No, I think that all these questions have been remarkable, but talk about representations in that, and New Canada and what's happening with our New Canada with all the new immigrants in that, and some of these questions that remain unanswered and will forever remain unanswered about indigeneity and global indigeneity and new Canadians, etc. I think one of the things that Charles and this group is trying to do for next year is a conference, a symposium, in which would be an opportune time, in which you have many voices and voices of all kinds, about this subject here. And I think it's the kind of thing we get to a deeper root, and I'm excited and interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. And what is it that we bring here? I mean, it's not so much a debate, but rather it's, okay, how do we come to terms together? And I think it's a subject that we can all share upon and disagree upon, of course. But I think next year, and I think this is just the beginning, is what I understand you guys are saying, is to talk about indigeneity from so many perspectives. I think this is just one. We can talk about modernity, colonization, pop culture, and transculturalism, et cetera. And I think those are exciting opportunities we can speak to, and I think that to me is exciting.
Right. Well, until next year, thank you.